In the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So one day in college, a friend and I were just hanging out. He and I had been good friends for a long time, and we had a lot of fun, a lot of honest conversations. He knew that I was active in the faith community at college, but he didn't find a lot of value in that, and so we gave faith a wide berth in our conversations most of the time. Except for this one day. I don't know if it was near a holiday or something. It may have been the spring of our junior year, so maybe Easter was coming near. But somehow religion came up in the middle of one of our conversations when it never had before. Maybe I said something about giving up chocolate for Lent or something like that, and my friend pretty bluntly and quickly said, I can't really get behind that, man. I mean, I just don't know. I'm not really sure if God exists, and I just don't know how to tell. I'm just not sure I believe in God. Now, he was standing up and starting to walk out of the room as he said this, but it kind of felt like he was throwing this softball to me. Like he was saying, I don't know if he was saying that he didn't know whether God existed or whether he couldn't be certain whether God existed or what. But in this moment, it felt like he was saying to me, well, you do this stuff and I don't. How do you figure it out? In that moment, out of pure luck, something possessed me, and something altogether coherent came out of my mouth. I hope I can remember it well enough to repeat it to you because it was fully inspiration speaking and not me, myself, if you know what I mean. I said something like, gosh, I don't really know either, man. I don't have any proof. Each day I just take a step. I've had this connection, this experience, and each day I try and figure it out a little bit more. I ask a question and I try and find an answer a little bit at a time. And I guess maybe I'm not going to ever figure it all out, but I'm just going to keep trying each day and see who God is and connect a little bit more. And my friend said, cool. I can get behind that, man, and finished walking out of the room. I share that story with you today in the spirit of our friend, Doubting Thomas. Thomas, the disciple, one of the 12, called Didymus sometimes because he was somebody's twin. Thomas gets read every year on this Sunday, the Sunday after Easter. And if you think about it, he gets a little bit of a short straw. Part of it is that this is the Sunday where people don't go to church that much. It is the week after Easter, and everyone is spent from a wonderful Holy Week. And so lots of people take a moment to put their feet up on a Sunday morning instead of coming to church. And so they miss Thomas's story, which is too bad, it turns out, because Thomas is a pretty good guy if you think about it. But the real albatross around Thomas's neck is the sentence that Jesus says to him. In the reading, he is not sure whether he believes. The disciples tell him of this wondrous thing, and he says, I don't know. And then a few days later, he's with the disciples, and Jesus comes again, and he says, my God, which is what you would say. And Jesus says, you believe because you saw how great. And then he says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. And because we live in the aftermath of the Enlightenment, because we live in a world of empiricism and a world where we want proof, we think that that is what this story is about. We think about the story is about proof, and so we take that sentence that Jesus says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, and we think that Thomas must have failed somehow. He must not have gotten it. And if there is a way that he did not get it, and there is a way that other people got it, then we think Thomas did it the wrong way, and we think that Jesus must then be saying that people who do not see him and still believe are the better ones, and that Thomas is somehow the not so good one. We think that Thomas doesn't make the cut, And so because of that, we hang this appellation around his neck, Doubting Thomas, sort of consigning him to the second string of the apostles. Now, it is true that he did doubt. He was not sure what people said to him. But it was because they were saying something outlandish. Their teacher, their beloved teacher, had died, had been killed, and had suddenly come to new life. He was incredulous a little bit, and I would offer to you that that doubt, that incredulity, was a good thing for him and is a good thing for us. Now, the first way that we can tell that Thomas is not being judged by Jesus' statement, "Blessed are you who have not seen," is by looking at the story that surrounds Thomas. Remember, just last week we saw in John's Gospel Mary Magdalene walking up to the empty tomb, seeing no one there. She runs back to Peter and to John, and she says, "They've taken his body. I am not sure what is going on." And Peter and John don't believe her at first. In fact, Mary's not sure that she believes what's going on. The angels that she meets have to explain it to her. All of them doubt from top to bottom. They're all confused. They're all unsure, and they look for proof. What do? They run back to the tomb. Peter and John may be hopeful and remembering that what Jesus said, see the empty tomb and wonder, could this be true? So they run off in search of Jesus, and then Mary turns around and has an encounter with the risen Christ right then and right there. In the midst of all this doubting and proof, that evening the disciples gathered together to talk, balanced on that sharp edge between fear and hope, worried about the persecution that the death of Jesus will bring towards them, but also hopeful with this news of his resurrection. And the only bad news is that one of their number does not make it for some reason. Thomas is not there. So Jesus appears to them, and the next day they run into Thomas and they say exactly what Mary said to Peter, "I saw Jesus." And Thomas isn't sure, just like Mary and Peter and John were before. And here's the interesting thing in doubting, and Thomas saying, "Well, I guess you had that experience, but I'm not sure I did." Thomas doesn't get kicked out of the group. He's not excused. No one says, "If you do not believe what we saw, then you've got to get out of here." Instead, they invite him back to dinner. They say, "Well, if you couldn't come on Sunday, why don't you come back next week?" The truth is that all of the people in the Easter story doubt, one after another. All of them are somehow amazed and unbelieving, wondering what is going on, fearful for the worst but hopeful for the best, trying to figure out what it all means. If you keep playing the tape forward, you will see that Thomas is actually a pretty good guy in the end. We know that he was deeply faithful. When he sees Jesus, he doesn't just accept Jesus' resurrection. He responds, he marches out, he goes out into the fields and starts to tell people. Now, you may not know this, but there is some history in the church that tells us that Thomas probably picked up a vocation like Paul did. He walked around to different towns and told people about Jesus. He probably didn't write letters the way Paul did, but he certainly popped up in lots of places. It's clear that he went to Syria, which is not close to Jerusalem. It's clear that he kept traveling and wandering, and there are some signs that point that he may have made it all the way to India. If you think about it, Peter and Paul, at the furthest of their travels, went to Rome, and India's got to be twice as far from Jerusalem. In fact, the Christian churches in India all trace their lineage back to Thomas. If this passage were meant to be an object lesson, if Thomas were the doubter and we were supposed to avoid his mistake, then Thomas could not have started a church. They would have picked someone who had done something more amazing. They would have picked someone who had done something more salutary. Now, if that doesn't convince you enough that Thomas is a good guy and gets a bad rap, let me offer you this final thing. The Gospel of John, which we read today, came together somewhere around the turn of the first century, 90 AD, 100 AD, 110, 120, something like that. That means, if you think about it, it was codified by a group of people who had never seen Jesus. Now, perhaps John the disciple was part of their community, and either he wrote the gospel or people listening to him wrote the gospel. So there's one exception, that John had seen Jesus in life. But even with that, it remains that the Gospel of John is a gospel meant for an audience who could never have seen Jesus in the flesh. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. When you read that to a group of people who couldn't have seen Jesus, it means that Jesus isn't judging Thomas for doubting. He is telling all the community of John instead, and all of us as well, that we are blessed, that it is amazing that we could believe this story that is, at its face, unbelievable. That we might have doubts about it, and yet we still allow ourselves to meet the risen Christ at the assurance of other people and be drawn into a living relationship with him. Because that's what this story is really about. It is not about doubt or faith. It is not about veracity or proof. It is about a living relationship with God and with Jesus. We miss that because we think about it, we think it's about whether Thomas believed that Jesus rose. Even the name Doubting Thomas misleads us. Instead, we think that it is somehow about whether Jesus actually came back to new life. Offering proof to Thomas, offering proof to us is easy, but then it locks us into this, yes, I believe, no, I don't. And when we are locked into that space, when God is limited to two choices, Jesus' resurrection gets left behind 2,000 years ago. It becomes a historic event that we choose to agree with or believe in, not a cosmic event that has impact on us today, now, and here. Anytime you try to limit God to two choices, either yes or no, you are imagining a God that is far too small. You are corralling a God in a way that God does not let happen. So Jesus instead is inviting us into being close with him day in and day out, letting our lives intertwine with his, letting our relationship with him deepen. Now, I'm not promising that if you let your relationship with Jesus deepen that you will end up going to India, but I am saying that your life will change like Thomas's. Something new will crop up in your life where you think it couldn't have happened before. So Thomas really is this great example for us today. He is a guide for us in a time where somehow we are both far too certain about what we think and yet not sure about anything. Thomas tells us that our doubts are important, that they leave room for us to be convinced by other people, and that they leave room for us to change our minds in the light of new experience. Thomas tells us that doubts are important, for they leave room for God, who is bigger than anything that you can imagine. So today, let us celebrate Thomas's doubting, welcoming new and unbelievable things into our lives. For in so doing, we will even welcome God. Amen.